them were all regarded as servants of the god. The performances were sacred. The spectators, too, along with the writers and the performers, were engaged in an act of worship. Dionysius himself was supposed to be present. His priest had the seat of honor. The point that Edith Hamilton is wanting to make here is that when we look at the Dionysian spring festival, we think, of course, today about spring break and college students going off to do crazy in Cancun or whatever. But for the Greeks, the Dionysian festival was worship. It was like going to church, if you will. Okay? And everybody involved saw this as a sacred act, even though the actions committed, we might say, are kind of a little bit, kind of crazy, getting drunk and partying and the like, you see. She continues. It's clear, therefore, that the idea of the God of holy inspiration, who could fill men with his spirit to write gloriously and to act gloriously, became far more important than the earlier ideas of him. The first tragic plays, which are among the best there are, never equaled except by Shakespeare, were produced in the theater of Dionysius. Comedies were produced there too, but tragedies far outnumbered them, and there was a reason why. And of course, when we've given our lectures on Aristotle and his Poetics, while he wrote about the importance of comedy, he always gave tragedy far greater supremacy. This strange god, the gay reveler, the cruel hunter, the lofty inspirer, was also the sufferer. He, like Demeter, was afflicted, not because of grief for another as she was, but because of his own pain. He was the vine which is always pruned as nothing else that bears fruit, every branch cut away, only the bare stalk left. Through the winter, a dead thing to look at, an old gnarled stump seeming incapable of ever putting forth leaves again. Like Persephone, Dionysius died with the coming of the cold. Unlike her, his death was terrible. He was torn to pieces, in some stories by the Titans and others by Hera's orders. He was always brought back to life. He died and rose again. It was his joyful resurrection they celebrated in this theater, but the idea of terrible deeds done to him and by men under his influence was too closely associated with him ever to be forgotten. He was more than the suffering god. He was the tragic god. There was none other. He had still another side. He was the assurance that death does not end all. His worshippers believed that his death and resurrection showed that the soul lives on forever after the body dies. This faith was part of the mysteries of Eleusis. At first, it centered in Persephone, who also rose from the dead every spring. But as queen of the black underworld, she kept even in the bright world above a suggestion of something strange and awful. How could she, who carried always about her the reminder of death, stand for the resurrection, the conquest of death? Dionysius, on the contrary, was never thought of as a power in the kingdom of the dead. There are many stories about Persephone in the lower world. Only one about Dionysius. He rescued his mother from it. In his resurrection, he was the embodiment of the life that is stronger than death. He, and not Persephone, became the center of the belief in immortality. Around the year 80 AD, a great Greek writer, Plutarch, received news when he was far from home that a little daughter of his had died, a child of most gentle nature, he says. In his letter to his wife, he writes, quote, "About that which you have heard, dear heart, that the soul once departed from the body vanishes and feels nothing. I know that you give no belief to such assertions because of those sacred and faithful promises given in the mysteries of Bacchus, which we who are of that religious brotherhood know. We hold it firmly for an undoubted truth that our soul is incorruptible and immortal. We are to think of the dead, that they pass into a better place, in a happier condition. Let us behave ourselves accordingly, outwardly ordering our lives, while within all should be pure, wiser, incorruptible." Well, this is an interesting idea, the idea that out of this Dionysian festival will begin to emerge notions of the immortality of the soul. Well, let's finish now with a few final thoughts as we look then at this chapter. One, let's make this observation. We said it before. Myths are stories to explain the unexplainable. Explain why it is the case that for a certain period of the year, Ruthie's tree out there will beautifully grow, it will produce those leaves, etc., etc. And then all of a sudden in October, November, for us, that tree begins to lose all of its leaves and begins to die. It looks dead. Can you explain that? The seasons, that is. Well, how do you explain it? Simple. Demeter is sad because her daughter Persephone is stuck in the underworld. But soon Persephone will be allowed to leave the underworld because of the arrangement with Zeus. And then, of course, Demeter will get happy. And guess what? Ruthie's tree will come back again. That notion of rebirth is then central, right? Of course, how can you explain artistic inspiration of any kind? The Greeks loved this question, and their answer is, well, Dionysius obviously is at the root of all inspiration, and to that degree, worthy of respect and worship, we might say. I mean, I think it's a fascinating question. Why is it the case that even in our culture, brilliant people, who usually are also very wealthy, will all dress up and go and sit in a room, the Academy Awards, where there's all of these awards that are given and all of this respect is shown to the film culture. And of course we do the same thing with the visual arts as well, right? Painting and the like, when we have certain kinds of presentations or whatever. Why is so much respect, we might say, given to the arts? And the answer will be, well, this notion that Dionysius the god still needs to be referenced or worshipped. Number two, and here of course we're making 3A observations, aren't we? Well, think about the great essay by the German philosopher Nietzsche, Apollonian Dionysius. In this essay he makes an observation. There are two, it seems, kinds of personality types. And the Greeks, Nietzsche said, understood this better than the current Europeans of his day. What do you mean they understood something that modern Europeans could not understand? Well, Nietzsche said we have a tendency to kind of bifurcate, split in half, two different types of personalities. One, the Apollonian type, very ordered, very organized, very about making sure everything is done right and well. And then on the other hand, we have the kind of like crazy, wild side, right? The going out, having a good time, losing ourselves in some kind of artistic creation or artistic production or by other kinds of activities, if you're legal, right? Right. But for Nietzsche, he said, in Apollonian Dionysian, the essay, he said what the Greeks understood was the importance of both of these two. That you have to have both. You have to have the Apollonian, you have to have the organization, you have to have the ordered kind of understanding of the world. But you also need this other side. You need this Dionysian side, this crazy side, this wild side, this inspired side. They have to go together. And to that degree then, this is what makes, for Nietzsche, this is what makes Greek culture so important. We need both sides. Finally, number 3. In the earlier introductory chapter, Edith Hamilton quoted those lines from Wordsworth's "The World is Too Much With Us," a text that we have lectured at length elsewhere. You'll remember, he says it, "Great God, I'd rather be a pagan Greek, suckled in a creed outworn, so might I, standing on this pleasant lea, have glimpses that would make me less forlorn, have sight of Proteus rising from the sea, or herald Triton blow his wreathed horn." In other words, Wordsworth is asking a question, I think, worth his consideration, worth our consideration. What is the difference between the Christian view of the world and the Greek view of the world? And what Wordsworth says is, the Greeks had some sense that all of nature is somehow animated with life, and therefore sacred to some degree. The idea that all of nature is somehow inspired, if you will. And he says, I love the idea that for the Greeks, you could go down to the ocean, and when you looked at the ocean, you didn't just see water. You saw something animating it. Those gods, for example, Triton is the one he mentions, or Proteus. Well, let's turn now to chapter 3, Cosmogonic Myths. Hamilton calls it How the World and Mankind Were Created. And let's continue with some interesting stories as we begin to try and play games of connecting this information to other information. You yourself can take these stories of both Demeter as well as Dionysius and ask, how do those stories get played out in some of the literature that I'm most familiar with? Thank you. I hope you'll come back to study more.